At least, they probably said, at least it was a dry heap. The weary crowd stood and fidgeted beneath the desert sun, a few miles south of the ruins of Sodom. They were tired. They listened closely. They knew they didn't have long yet. All their lives they had looked up to him, revered him, the oldest man they had ever seen, their only leader all their days. He was dying. But with what little strength the dying old man had left, he wanted to impart final wisdom for as long as he could hold out until he just was no more on this earth. He'd just come out of the big tent in the heart of the camp. So they gathered around to hear what he had learned in there. With a wavering voice, he began to sing, line by line, teaching them. Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak. He went on to sing of the greatness and faithfulness of the God who led them. He sang how one and only one God had found them in a howling waste, had circled and hovered like a mama eagle. He sang of their relationship. He sang of prosperity. He sang of satisfaction, but he sang too. He sang too of abandonment and idolatry. Sang of mockery and faddishness. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods they had never known, to new gods that had come recently whom your fathers never dreaded. And the old man sang of the response of an offended deity. They have made me jealous with what is no God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So I will make them jealous with those who are no people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. Oh yes, the old man warned in his song. If they persisted in provoking their God to jealousy, he'd return the favor. And he would use the power of jealousy and of punishment to get them on the right track again. The old man sang. And he, this old man Moses, explained why he sang. For in the tent of meeting, the Lord God, shrouded in clouds and swirling mists, had told him of how the people were itching for affliction. And the Lord God said to him, when many evils and troubles come upon them, this song shall confront them as a witness, for it will live unforgotten in the mouths of their offspring. And so it did indeed. Over 1,200 years after Moses sang the song and was shortly gathered to his fathers, as the saying went, the descendants of the audience that day in the Jordanian desert were in the rather sad state Moses had foreseen and foreknown. See, about 1,200 years later, the promised one had come. The God who birthed them as a nation, the rock of their salvation, stooped to walk among them. This Messiah, this long-awaited hope, came to his own, and his own received him not. But then after his death and resurrection, there was a wave of hope, of gathering. All of a sudden, on the day of Pentecost, thousands of scattered Israelites believed. And it didn't stop at Pentecost. More repented on a daily basis. In just moments, it was 5,000, not 3,000. And the pace increased from there. It got faster. It picked up more steam. We read, they multiplied greatly, and a great many of the priests became obedient to the faith. The long-awaited acceptance was here for Israel. Until it wasn't. Things began to shift. They started to change. Wherever the missionaries went, some believed, but then the others, the masses, didn't. So some missionaries, like Paul and Barnabas, announced, behold, we are turning to the Gentiles. And And so things proceeded from there. In time, in places like Rome, there were a few churches that had a Jewish presence, but not all of them did. And not all of them in great number. Because there was a season when many Jews were exiled from the city by imperial decree. And so the Gentiles, non-Jews left behind in the churches, learned how to get along by themselves without Jewish members among them. And then the suffering Jews, believing and unbelieving, returned to the city and things got messy. We talked about that messiness the other week, how some Roman Gentile Christians got a new idea. And the new idea that some Gentile Christians got in their heads was this: if the door's open for us, that means it's closing for the Jews. If we're in God's favor, it means we, the Gentile church, are taking Israel's place away from them. All that Jewish stuff, that's old-fashioned now. That's obsolete. That's out of touch with the real condition of the modern-day world, they were thinking. That's so BC. Don't you know it's the year 57? Clearly, they thought God and Paul had rejected the Jews and turned exclusively to the Gentiles because that's where the future of the church was at. And everything else would be safely disregarded, they thought. So Paul has to wade into the muck and mire and do some explaining, and boy does Paul have a lot to say. We've been listening to Paul for a few weeks now, and what he wants them to know when it comes to the opportunity to be rescued and brought into the heart of God's work now, not just back then, but now, there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same is the Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call him, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. It just takes two things: confessing and believing. And as we've seen, those are both centered in the life and death and life again of Jesus, the long-awaited Messiah, the good news about his arrival and his sacrifice and his present and eternal rule. And Paul says that God sent out messengers to preach the same good news to Jews and Gentiles alike. But then Paul has to admit, at the national level, Israel has ignored those messengers, shot them down, rejected the good news, refused to join in the celebration. They have not all obeyed the gospel, Paul admits. What do you do with that? What do you do when God's own people aren't on board? Well, it raises questions. What's the problem? Didn't the messengers reach them? Well, Paul says that can't be it. Their voice has gone out to all the earth and their words to the ends of the world. Well, don't they know the consequences? Well, sure they did. They remembered Moses' song. Just like God said, it confronts them as a witness even now. And then Isaiah contrasted God's overtures toward a disobedient and contrary people with God being found by those who did not seek him. On that note, it sure sounds like the Gentile Christians of Rome are right. It sounds like they have replaced a rebellious and thrown away Israel with their church. Paul explains the story is a lot more complicated than that. Has God rejected his people? No way, he says. How could that be, though, Paul? What's your proof? In spite of everything we're seeing in the world around us, they might ask him, what is your proof that God isn't finished with it? He says, I offer myself as Exhibit A. He and other Jewish Christians like him are the proof. He says, for I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. See, he foreknew them, even in their rebellion, Even in their abandonment, even in their apostasy, he foreknew them. But the way things have always worked is that even in the moments when Israel is the most astray, when Israel as a body was just totally dead set against God, even then, like in the days of Elijah, God kept a remnant, a mini Israel within Israel, who stood as a placeholder for the whole until better days would come. And Paul says, so too at the present time, there is a remnant, a Jewish remnant, chosen by grace. And he says, because of that, historic Israel is split in two. The elect obtained what Israel was seeking, but the rest were hardened. Why? Why save leftovers of a failed nation? The Romans might be asking. Or why let there be such failure in a nation with a future? Did they stumble so as to fall? Paul says, no way! Rather, through their trespass, because they stumbled, salvation's come to you Gentiles, so as to make Israel jealous. It's just like Moses said in his song. Because Israel clung to their ignorance, God wanted to make them jealous with a no people, a foolish nation. God would lavish his attention on a no people so as to provoke his people into waking up. Israel's stumbling, bumbling, non-response to the gospel isn't the failure of God's plan. It's actually a key part of God's crafty plan. It is how God's crafty plan gets to save the Gentiles and the Israelites. Paul says that's what his ministry is all about. He's ministering to the Gentiles with an eye toward making his fellow Jews jealous, so that some, maybe even all, can be saved. Paul says history moves in these three stages. You know, it used to be the Gentiles were just totally on the outside, and the Israelites were the ones in covenant relationship with God. Then Israel rejected the gospel and was set aside from the limelight, but that paved the way for stage 2, massive success in the Gentile mission. But here's the thing. This that we're seeing now is just step 2 out of 3. And it's meant to provoke step 3, Israel's jealousy, leading to their acceptance, leading to their full inclusion. Again, not just a little remnant, but the main mass. That's what Paul is after. And that's why Paul can tell them, no, you Romans are getting this wrong. Israel is not obsolete. Israel is not just old-fashioned and outdated. Israel is not a permanent loser here, some secondary and now discarded thing among the Gentile church. Israel's salvation is still the end goal that God is driving at. And the whole thing, the thing that the Roman Gentiles have themselves joined, is rooted in God's covenant long ago with a man named Abraham. Jewish texts started calling Abraham the root of Israel. And Paul says, all right, that's right. Abraham's the root, and if the root is holy, so are the branches. Then Paul wants to chase that image for a while. He says, imagine Israel is like this olive tree. And it's not some olive tree just out in the middle of nowhere. It is a cultivated, cared for olive tree. God has been giving this olive tree non-stop attention. Then things still went a little topsy-turvy. A lot of branches had to get cut off. Why'd they get cut off? Unbelief. He says it's a lack of the fruit of faith. So now you've got two things. You've got a growing tree with just a couple branches left on it, minority of its original natural branches, and then over in the corner, carefully stacked, is a pile of broken branches. And in a way, you could say both of them are Israel. The tree, Israel living. The branches, Israel in waiting. We've got this tree, and it's bare, almost. And there's a lot of room left on that trunk. So God goes and he gets branches from wild olive trees out in the woods somewhere. And he grafts those wild branches onto this cultivated olive tree of Israel. Now, wild branches from an olive tree, they're not terribly good for much most of the time. But once this living tree's sap starts flowing into them, once they get the same kind of lavish love and care, they come to life and they're fruitful. And now you might be tempted to say, hey, we're over here being fruitful. We're on the tree. You branches down there, you're not. Paul says, oh, but wait a minute. Lest you get smug over that heap of Israelite wood in the corner, just remember, you're not a natural fit for that tree. You didn't start on that tree. The only reason life is flowing through you is because it's coming from the holy root of the patriarchs. And if you wild or formerly wild branches still aren't fruitful, God won't hesitate to chop you off again. Because you were brought in late in the game. And suppose God goes and grabs some of those branches in the corner and grafts them back in. Won't they take to it naturally? It's the same DNA. For if you were cut from what by nature is a wild olive tree, Paul says, and grafted against nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? It's their own. Not like this outlandish Gentile experiment that somehow works. So there is no room in these wild branches for pride. This is all God's plan, Paul says. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in the same way, all Israel will be saved. It's also topsy-turvy. When Jewish thinkers envisioned what was going to happen at the end of the world, here's what was in their head. Israel's in hard straits, but then God restores his Israelite people to glory. The fullness of Israel gets saved, and then the Gentiles see that and get drawn in design. So, first Israel, and then, as an afterthought, some Gentiles get to come in too at the very end. Paul flips that on his head. He says, hey, the Gentiles are already coming to Zion, even after it's been abandoned by so many natural-born citizens. The Gentiles are already joining up with the remnant, and when their full number is saved, and when mainstream Israel is finally fed up with their view from the bench, then they'll join in the game again, and all will get brought to glory together. In the meantime, he says, Gentile Romans, hey, you're right to see some hostility in Israel and the gospel, but you're wrong to think that means God's done with you. He can't be done with you. The gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. They cannot be taken back away from the heap of branches. It has all been God's plan to have both kinds of people under disobedience during a stage of their history, so that when everything's said and done, God gets to have mercy on all. That's what Paul says in chapters 10 and 11 of Romans. It might seem a bit, academic to us. We ask, what's that got to do with us? What do we do with that information? What are we, literally the people right here in these pews this morning, what are we supposed to get out of the picture Paul's drawing for us? Is it relevant? Does all of this have practical cash value for how we think and feel and act? Before we close, and I'm so glad we've got a little bit of time yet, I want to propose to you make 8 lessons, 8 points that I think you and I alike should be drawing from what Paul is saying. The first lesson is this. This picture Paul's drawing is how God sees history. This is history according to history's Lord. The entire sweep of human history over the past few years, and whatever history we're adding now as we live it in the moment, all the way until it wraps up, all of that is summarized in what Paul has just said. God first locked up the Gentiles in disobedience, but when it was Israel's turn, the Gentiles got mercy. And then in the end, by the mercy shown to Gentiles, all Israel will discover mercy afresh. That is human history, according to God. That is what history is all about. Israel and the Gentiles and God's determination to save both in mercy. Every other category of history is secondary. Now here in America, especially in the American church, we are obsessed with the idea that history is all about whatever is in front of us at the moment. A few years ago, a popular TV show called Parks and Recreation finished its run. And there was a very well-loved character on it who humorously gave voice to the way we really think in our hearts. And that character said on a rather involuntary trip to London, he said, "History began on July 4th, 1776. Everything before that was a mistake." Isn't that the way we sometimes think about history? Here's the reality. America ain't what history's about. The White House, Congress, the courts, our Declaration, our Constitution, our geopolitical power and influence, none of that is what history is about. Either we're a sideshow, or we are footnoted details as an example of one mostly Gentile nation within which some of Israel is scattered. Those are the two options. We are not one of the main categories by which God measures history. America is not a defining feature of history as God sees it. And that means the things that worry us, all the major obstacles and problems and temptations of the day in 21st century United States of America are not the main show either. The rise of secularism in America may not be great, but the fight between secularism and religion in America is not a key part of how God tells history. The role of other religions in the world today, say Islam, is a topic we cannot seem to avoid. And God has His purposes for all of that because He is a God of the details as much as the main thing. But when God lets us in on the mystery of history, Islam is not the title. Its details, not a main category. Same is true for the big political questions. Democracy, monarchy, conservatism, liberalism, capitalism, communism. Those conflicts are not the way God tells history. And we would do well to retrain ourselves to see history, especially the history we're living right now, less in terms of our own self-appointed anxieties and more in terms of the categories God uses to tell it. Israel, Gentiles, grace, faith, mercy, Christ, fullness. See, the way God tells history, it's about natural Israel and the now grafted Gentiles having their turns in the limelight till all Israel, regrafted natural and grafted wild branches alike, will be saved. That's what history is about as God tells it. What if we learn to see history like that? See history as it unfolds every day in the news and terms of that? How would that change how we think? Well, second, what Paul says here should retrain how we think of church. Question: what is the church? Fundamentally, what is the church? Is the church a separate, new, Gentile body that came into being as the torch passed out of Jewish hands? That's the way we sometimes think about it. Paul says the answer is no. The church as we know it today, the church as it is in this world, is Israel between surgeries. We are post-op and pre-op Israel. See, the key feature is this. What we call the church is not a second entity alongside Israel. It is not a second entity replacing Israel. The church just is Israel. The olive tree of God's care. We here in the sanctuary have been grafted into Israel by being included through faith in the life of Israel's Messiah, who, as it turns out, is the main trunk of the tree. And I don't mean the Middle Eastern country that calls itself by the name Israel, which is mostly part of that pile of broken branches still. The living Israel is the church of Jesus Christ. Which means that you, yes, even you once wild branches, are in a sense adopted as Israelites. That's us, for most of us. It means the Old Testament story is not some other story, some old foreign story. It's our story. When we read the Old Testament, we shouldn't say they, we should say we. Think of it like this. I'm pretty sure that most of us in here are also American. When we talk about the American Revolution, don't we as American citizens usually say, we beat the British? We fought the crown and won our independence? Now, as far as I'm aware, none of the people in the sanctuary at the moment were personally enlisted under the command of General Washington. But we identify ourselves with the same national whole on behalf of whom the Continental Army fought. When an immigrant comes to America and becomes a naturalized citizen, isn't it a great moment when they start referring to the American heritage in terms of we, not they? Right? It's the same thing here. When we read the Old Testament, that has become our new backstory, our new heritage. The patriarchs have become our root as long as we're grafted in through faith. That's why we've got the Old Testament still in our Bibles. It's not just for background research to look at on occasion but then get back to the real stuff. It's not just for reference. It is living Scripture given for us today. It is our Scripture. Our Bible, this Old Testament, just as much as any of what the apostles wrote. And since it's all our story, we better get familiar with all of it. Now the problem is, so often when we tell people the gospel, when we explain to them how things started and then where Jesus fits in and what he's all about, we give people the impression he must have been crucified in Genesis 4. Because we hop straight from the fall of the cross. And we gloss over everything that came in between. We need to see Jesus on the cross is the organic center of a big story of God and his mission-carrying people. The whole story of pre-cross Israel is no optional add-on. It's what we're implying when we call Jesus the Christ. There is no such thing as a Christian to whom the Old Testament is irrelevant. Only Christians who are still ignorant of that. Third thing. Jewishness remains highly relevant to God's church. Like we said, the church is Israel, with wild branches grafted in, temporarily missing most, but not all, the natural branches. And God promises to regraft them once all the wild ones meant to be added have found their spot. The church, as we know it, grows from Jewish roots. And the church's present life is predicated on having a Jewish remnant living and believing in our midst. Unlike what the Romans were thinking, and unlike the ways we've tried to normalize it, a totally un-Jewish church would be a bizarrely unnatural thing, no matter how used to it we've gotten. To tell the truth, there are big stretches of church history where we've been major failures on this. There are big stretches of church history where we've tried to banish Jews and Jewish culture from the church. We have horribly mistreated Jews inside and outside the church. And to be brutally honest about those atrocious failures, whenever that has happened, it has been a betrayal of the gospel. But on the flip side, whenever we've embraced our Old Testament heritage while standing firm in New Testament liberty, and when we welcome the natural branches that are still among us, it is a fruitful blessing to any local body of believers. When a church gets to have members who are in fact descended from the patriarchs themselves, when a church has members whose ancestors were there when Moses sang a song for the first time, members whose ancestors lived under the rule of David and Solomon, members whose ancestors stood in covenant with God during the long eons when many of our families in Europe or Africa or East Asia were still lost. Well, when we have members who are descended from the patriarchs like Paul was, we need to cherish and celebrate that, don't we? Because those members are living proof of a promise-keeping God. Those members are the rare, precious, valuable, surviving natural branches. They are the remnant who let the church be what it is. In fact, in this church, we're enormously blessed to have at least one family, maybe more I don't know about, who are such natural branches. Thanks for being here. Fourth thing we can get from what Paul's saying. We have to remember this. It is still all about grace, not works. Even for the remnant of natural branches, it's not an entitlement. It's not something earned. It's mercy. It's grace. Paul says it's a remnant chosen by grace. But if it's by grace, it's no longer on the basis of works. Otherwise, grace would no longer be grace. Not earned, not entitled, a free gift of God even for the remnant, and just the same for the wild branches of Gentiles grafted in. Wild branches don't bring any productivity with them to the cultivated tree. It can't be by works for any of us. It has to be by grace for all of us. God does not want anyone to get into His kingdom under the illusion they somehow earned their spot. He wants to be very clear about this, and that's why He's organized history the way He has. Whether you're a Jew or whether you're a Gentile by birth, it is nothing you worked for. It is nothing you achieved. It is grace conditioned on your perseverance and faith. It's the mercy of God. Fifth thing, look at the strategic mind our God has. Careful balancing of Jewish and non-Jewish interests. Millennia-long scheme to lure and entice both into the realm of His mercy. I could never come up with this. I'm just not that smart. All of us putting our heads together, I don't think we'd ever in a million years have come up with God's plan. And yet the whole cycle in its full orbit leads to everybody being treated on even footing. Neither ends up with room for boasting, but both savor God's grace and mercy. Neither will have any excluded who could otherwise have been saved. This is literal divine genius. I urge you, just spend some time this week meditating on how God's mind works. And if you really see that, you can't help but trust Him. Sixth thing, note what Paul expects people to see in us. Paul expects that as mainstream Israel sees the Gentiles enjoying with the remnant all of Israel's historic blessings, all the closeness with God that had been theirs, they will be provoked to jealousy and want back in on what they see us have. The entire plan hinges on that. Think about what we're saying with Paul when we say that. Paul expects us to be enjoying so much of God that his historic people get jealous over how much deeper into God we get through Jesus than they can get outside of Jesus, so that in their jealousy they'll see how much they need Jesus. Is your relationship with God something that committed, devout practitioners of other religions have a reason to be jealous over? Does what you have constitute fair grounds for the jealousy of those who don't? Because that's the plan. That is God's plan. Think about that. Cultivate it. Dive into that. 7. Look at the way Paul talks about what the gospel has already brought us right here and right now. What does Israel's failure, as he calls it, mean for the rest of us? What's he say? Riches for the Gentiles. What does their temporary rejection mean? Paul says, the reconciliation of the world. What about the consequence of Israel's trespass? What do we get because of it? Paul says, riches for the world. Riches for the world. Now, we get so easily caught up in the problems of our lives. Our sickness, our grief, our bankruptcy, our schools and our jobs and our schedules. But do we have our eyes open to the fact that in receiving the gospel, in having the opportunity to be grafted onto the tree God is tending, in encountering grace through Jesus, we are being made rich right now beyond our wildest dreams? Do we understand, do we see that the gospel is in fact, right this moment, right here, in this sanctuary, riches for the world? Paul tells us that Jesus came, and the good news is the reason he came was so you might become rich. And Paul says his ministry to the Gentiles, the reason for it, the effect of it, was making many rich. Not with money, not with stocks, not with cars and TVs or whatever it is you collect, but with the riches of God's kindness and forbearance and patience. With the riches of His glory. With the riches of His grace. The riches of His glorious inheritance. For Paul says he was called to preach to the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ. And exactly that is what you have and are receiving and can enjoy this very moment through faith in Him. Becoming rich because the Lord Jesus is presently here and now bestowing His riches on all who call on Him. Do you see the precious value of the gospel given to you and all that you can have right now, right here through it? Riches for the world. The eighth, the last thing I want to share this morning. All that, everything I just said, is like a trickle. A little drip from a clogged hose through a narrow channel. But Paul says there's a flood in store. If Israel's trespass means riches for the world, how much more will their full inclusion? If Israel's rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? What we are getting now are the blessings filtered through the remnant, the apostles, and the Jewish believers in every age who are like them. And that has already, this little trickle, proven to be riches for the world, but it is a pittance next to the flood of wealth and blessing and life set to be unleashed when the narrow channel of the remnant is expanded wide to all Israel. There is something more than the presently experienced unsearchable riches, and that something more is yet in store. And it's not just more. Paul says it is much more. Beyond reconciliation, it's resurrection. It's life from the dead. It's the fullness of seeing face to face, of knowing as we are known, of beholding the Father with unshrouded eye, of walking in glorious victory in an incorrupt new creation with a resurrected Christ. It's more than words can tell, but it's the how much more. It's the life from the dead that is waiting in store for that day when all Israel, the general collection of natural branches, are graciously grafted in again by faith into the one tree, when they are accepting and accepted, when they are fully included beyond their former trespass, and when God has his way of mercy for all. And for that we hope and pray. And like Paul, we hope to magnify our ministry so that that day will come. Thanks be to the God of Israel, to the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, to the God of the olive tree that grows by grace from its Abrahamic root of richness into the unsearchable riches of Christ. Thanks be to God for the remnant of Israel he's preserved. Thanks be to God for these wild branches he's grafting in from all nations. Thanks be to God for the miracle he promises yet to do, to save all Israel and bring life from the dead. Thanks be to this God in Jesus, the Messiah, our Lord. Amen.